You know how people are always talking about how you should let that friend go or let that person go or let that partner go who isn't really serving you anymore? What if that thing that's not really serving you anymore is a part of your business or part of your podcast or part of your brand? What do you do then? How do you pivot in a successful way that doesn't turn everybody off? Today, I want to unpack one of the more thoughtful pivots I feel like I've ever seen, truly. And I don't know if you know who this person is, and even if you don't, it's not really keen that you truly know who this person is. We just need to really utilize his pivot in his podcast as kind of like a little case study. So, if you have heard of Lecrae, that's who we're focusing on today. He has done a major, within the last 4 to 5 months, he's done a major shift in his podcast and his brand as a whole. And I think it's something that we should really take a moment to figure out what's working, what's not, potentially, from the outside looking in. Because as people, we're trying to figure all the things out endlessly all the time. And I don't think we have to keep trying to figure out the things by ourselves. We can borrow wisdom from other people and be able to plug and play what works for us. We're never really going to create anything brand new, but we can be able to figure out how we can maneuver our business in a way that serves us rather than us always serving the business, because we created businesses in order for it to implement into our life, not the other way around, you know? So for those that don't know, Lecrae is a Grammy winning artist. He is often or most immediately thought of as a Christian rapper or a rapper as a whole. And he's done a huge host of things. He's known for mixing faith and culture. He's known for launching the Deep In podcast. I think that their intro to his podcast is so cool. It's like I don't even want to try to recreate it, but it's so good.
This is the Deep End with Lecrae.
It's like a DJ restarting. You know, the old school DJs, how they would have their tagline, maybe, is that the word? How they would have their tagline. And that's probably on purpose because, again, he's in hip hop, right? So the main thing is Lecrae's transition, his pivot is really making sure that people know and understand that he's not only a rapper, he's not only a music artist, but he's also a storyteller. He's also a truth teller. He's also a follower of Christ, all these things. And at some point, you felt like that wasn't really accurately being represented in his brand, especially in his podcast. And we're using his podcast specifically because we can see all the things kind of just laid out there for us, which is the beauty of podcasting. We're able to see in slow motion almost someone's evolution to a certain degree. So Lecrae specifically took this pivot seriously. He and his team, I'm sure, took this pivot very seriously to the point where they did an entire podcast episode about it. That episode was literally called "I'm Restarting This Podcast." Okay. So sometimes you just got to lay the things right on out there, let people know what's going on so that they can decide what's going to fit for them versus not. Because there's sometimes people get used to seeing a version of us and they don't want to go along for the ride. But Lecrae takes this, 54-minute podcast episode to reflect and figure out, okay, what's not working? And I want to be able to, speaking as Lecrae, I want to be able to dive in to understand what's not working. Why does this feel so icky? Because I think a lot of times we think in business, it always has to be spreadsheets and numbers. I'm a very logical, linear thinker. So sometimes when it calls for, I'm not often in my creative brain. So when it comes to being in business, I think we often feel like we have to be in our black and white brain. Does it fit into the spreadsheet? Does it all these things. Where a good portion of it, I would say even 30 to 40% of business is feelings. So when it feels icky, when it feels like you can't quite mesh all the things in together, when do you take a pause to recalibrate, to reflect, to figure out, do I need to pause on this altogether? Do I need to stop this altogether? Do I need to find a new direction? And this 54-minute podcast episode is him doing exactly that, inviting people into the process of him explaining where he is, where he's come from, where in the music industry, where he's come from his podcasting journey, all of the things. And a lot of times that boils down to burnout. If you're creating content all the time, we are very susceptible to burnout because there's always something to look at. There's always something, some new trend to go on. There's always some new take to have. And that can be kind of exhausting, especially especially in podcasting, really, because you're always trying to figure out, I need to talk for 30, 45, an hour long. What the heck am I going to talk about to keep people interested, to do storytelling to the extent that I really think I can, that's going to keep people invested into this specific episode for as long as possible? That's hard. That is hard. And one of the things that he literally said that was the budging portion of it was, something always gets sacrificed, and it's not going to be my family anymore. I have spoken about this many different times on different podcast episodes, where oftentimes for the sake of business, for the sake of content, for the sake of being seen and visibility, we sacrifice certain things. For me, for a long time, it has been my health. I have mentioned on previous podcast episodes that I used to be the girl that was drinking 5 cups of coffee every day all day. And my first meal was when I went home, or the only time I was really eating was when it was like, what do they call it? A working lunch. That's crazy. And for Lecrae, in this example, it was his family. It was his mental state. And that is the opposite of what we're looking to do, because we need to be able to facilitate a space for people to feel comfortable, to come and sit down, to take your coat off, to grab a drink, to feel safe to be here, because you're curating that space for people on purpose, because then that ushers them through from being a listener to a fan, to being a part of your community, to ultimately being a client of yours to help them solve a problem that they have. And you can't do that if you're constantly sacrificing yourself. For Lecrae, it was his family. For me, it was my health. What is it for you? If you're taking a pause to figure out, okay, if I want to maneuver on with this content, maneuver on with branding and business and how I'm maneuvering things in my business, is there something that's taking a backseat that actually needs to be on the hood of the car? I could not keep going with 5 cups of coffee every single day. That was probably literally killing me. Not the greatest decision. Not the advice that I would give anybody. All with the intent of growing someone else's dream. And then I shifted to being a business owner. And now I'm trying to grow what I feel like God has placed on my heart in order to support and solve problems for people out here in the world. And just because you do it for yourself doesn't mean that the intent and the fever and the intensity behind all of it changes. Those same habits that you had there are just traveling over. So that was one of the main turning points for Lecrae, as well as being able to lean into true, real stories, what the mission behind the podcast was for him. Because it's hard to show up every single day to a business, to a podcast, to a brand, if it doesn't match with what you got going on anymore. So what the podcast was it was largely conversations that stemmed from the music industry, largely conversations that stemmed from the evangelical church and all these things, and testing the waters, if you will, to be able to figure out, oh, how do I need to show up? Do I need to show up like this person? Do I need to show up like that person? I think one of the people that he felt like he needed to show up like was Tim Ross, and probably, I've mentioned in past episodes, we don't need to always show up like Mel Robbins or Dave Ramsey or Stephen Bartlett just because they are doing podcasting well. They're doing content well for the demographic that we're looking to serve. The deep end really went from spending all this time talking about hot topics, talking about kind of clickbaity things, to be quite frank with you, very clickbaity things to get people in the video, to get people in the episode, which, if you're looking at the numbers, he did what needed to be done. The numbers were there. The numbers are there, even as we're looking at the podcast now. Has it dipped a little bit? Absolutely. I say just by a couple 10,000 views, but that's 10,000 individual views. So we're watching this pivot happen. We're watching him go from telling the stories of the select few to now we're getting raw, redemptive storytelling. If you look at specifically his YouTube channel, you are able to see where the shift dramatically happened. Not even just because there's this stark, I'm restarting the podcast episode, but more so from the extent of the stories that are being talked about are different. They have a little bit of different heart that's being offered to the table. It's less about the celebrity or the speaker that's being featured in the podcast episode, and more so about what do they have to offer to the table. An example that I bring up in private conversations often is, just because you have a really cool person to interview doesn't mean that the interview is inevitably going to be good. If you're going to have even Beyonce, if you're going to have even Beyonce on the mic interviewing her as a podcast guest, I'm going to do my due diligence to figure out what does my ideal listener, what do the people who typically listen to this podcast want to know from Beyonce? To be quite frank, I don't know that they want to know the story behind individual songs. Maybe the fangirl in me does, but I don't know that they would want to know that. So you can see that there's less polish, less People Magazine kind of vibes, and more of, how do I share the gospel? How do I share the news and share my mission with so many other people? There's purpose behind it. In the previous episode, I talked about being open to just testing the data, figuring out is this going to work? I don't know. Let me lean into that. And the people who actually stay to listen, the people who actually stay to view that, are your people. So now, what do you and I, take from the pivot that we're noticing in Lecrae's work, in the Deep End podcast? Your identity is not tied to a format, okay? We can, again, test and plug and play a whole bunch of different things. Your brand is going to evolve with you. If you bring on even a bookkeeper, you do not have to begrudgingly sit down every Friday morning and talk about or look at your books to figure out, am I good? Am I in the green? What is in the black? Maybe I'm speaking personally on that one, but I don't think we always have to stick to a specific format, which is why we notice with Lecrae, again, that there's a pivot that's happening over time. There's an evolution that's happening over time. And when you find out that, hey, this doesn't feel good, or this doesn't match with who I am right now, or this doesn't match with my specific flow right now, change. Now, I say that with a caveat because I feel like sometimes we get a little bit, shiny object syndrome, where we don't want to see, if it's not panning out most immediately, we don't want to see how far it can go, how far it can take us. My rule of thumb is try something for 90 days. If it doesn't, on that 91st day, if it still don't feel right, if it's still not working, then you can shift it up. But you're not really getting any true data from anything. It takes 90 days for algorithms to really settle into what you got going on. It takes individual people to really settle into understanding, oh, this is what they do now. This isn't just a 21-day challenge. This isn't just a 30-day challenge. This is what they do. So we don't have to stick to a specific format. We can change and be open to evolving. We see that all the time, especially with artificial intelligence. The way that we are working right now is dramatically changing because of the way that artificial intelligence is finding its way into our daily life. And to be honest, has been finding its way into our daily life. The whole Google predictive text, I remember 4 or 5 years ago, Google was trying to predict what I was going to, not Google, Gmail, same thing, was trying to predict what I was going to write in the email. And I was like, no, that's not what I'm going to write. You think you're so fast. And now it's dang near spot on, man. The other thing is clarity comes from curiosity. You see in Lecrae's work that at some point he starts getting curious about everyday people who are changing the game within, because his mission and part of his branding is in faith content, or the merging between faith and culture. You see how he's offering an opportunity for people to tell their story, their redemptive story, their redemptive experience about either how God has changed something for them and or how their life has dramatically shifted in some capacity. And that is a good thing. Being curious is the thing that, it's one of, you know how they have strength finders tests? Being curious is one of my strengths. And I think it's quite evident in the guest episodes that I do. I'm a little nosy, so I'm going to ask. Being curious offers us an opportunity to get some clarity about what we have going on. And we need to lean into that. Just because we're asking questions doesn't mean that we are inept. It doesn't mean that we are not qualified. To think of a question, to be the act of being curious, means that you care about something. It means that you are leaning into what is being presented in front of you. And we need to be able to lean into people, because that's how we get to be able to figure out, how do I solve my clients' problems better? How do I streamline this process? Because of curiosity. And Lecrae does a fantastic way of modeling that for us. Also, letting go to grow. I mentioned earlier that some of the views on his stuff has changed by 10,000 views at a time, depending on who he is having. You can tell which videos and which episodes are more so leaning into this new pivot, and which ones probably were just scheduled well in advance and they just had to put it out. And that's just with my podcast management brain assuming, outside looking in. So we have to be able to be okay with turning people off. And I know that in the dating world, that's like, oh, do I want to turn this person off? I don't know. That's not a good thing. But in business, if my personality doesn't mesh with you, perhaps I'm not the person for you. And I don't want to hold you back from experiencing the person that's going to be able to solve the exact same problem that I'm solving, but they just work in a different flow from me, or they just communicate in a different way from me. And that's simple as that. When you pivot, when you decide to make a change, or you decide to change your lifestyle, change your brand style, if you will, that's going to change who connects with you. And that's not a bad thing. You're just refining, and marketing world calls it niching down. You're just niching down, which makes it easier for the people that are looking for people like you, that solve problems like you, to find you, to connect with you, to be in community with you. And I think that we should lean into that. Even, now hear me, because it's going to get scary. Even if for a little while that means that nobody's listening. because sometimes you just got to reset the algorithm, whatever algorithm that we're speaking of in that moment. Sometimes the algorithm of life. We talk about how every single person, and I know without a doubt, every single person has been through a season where they have been by themselves because they decided to change the way that their life looked. So you're going to have a season, whether in life, whether in business, whether in content, where it's going to get real quiet, or just simply quieter than what it was before. And it's our responsibility to lean into that quietness to see, okay, I'm going to keep trying. I'm going to keep doing this to see, is it going to work? Is it going to work? Do I feel good when I'm creating it? Do people feel good when they're watching it? And I think that matters so much. The other aspect of that is, and it's something that I talked about again in the last episode with Q2 goals. Sometimes when you're leaning into something, one aspect of your business more, you have to be okay with letting other parts of that business go. For Lecrae, it was maybe you dial back on the live shows because it takes a lot of energy for Lecrae to show up at a live show. It just changes the way that you show up just a little bit. And being okay with testing it out for a season to figure out if this is what is for you. And then finally, we got to build in some breaks. Something that I got away from in 2024, one thing that I really stuck to is taking a forced pause the very last week of each quarter, where I was pausing. I spent time to evaluate my data. I spent time to say, okay, did this feel okay? Because any other time throughout that quarter, I'm hustling. I'm getting all the things done. I'm just pushing, challenging myself to keep going. But this week forces me to pause. And now this is my reminder to get back to doing that. And one of the things that Lecrae mentions is any good business works on the business, not just in it. We have to be able to look at things from a macro perspective, where sometimes we can get so sucked into the weeds. And sometimes there's seasons where we have to do that, especially if you are the main person in your business, especially if you haven't hired on employees, you're working with contractors for the most part. You gotta shift however it needs to shift in some capacity, but then building in time and intentionally building in time to take a break and see from a macro view, does this version of business feel right for me? Do the numbers tell me that this version of business, this version of content work for me? So overall, reflection is a part of the strategy. Big shout out to Lecrae and the team that is managing his podcast. Big shout out to them, because that is hard work to shift in the middle, openly shift in the middle. Some people just kind of do it and hope people just stick along with them, but to prepare people to make that shift, that takes a certain level of vulnerability that I truly, truly applaud.
Okay, editing Tahjma one more time. Me and the tiny microphone are back. You ever feel like you're showing up on podcasts, putting out all these episodes on different people's podcast episodes, your own podcast, creating content, but it's not really doing much for your business? Yeah, it's visibility, but is it actually leading to deeper relationships? Is it actually growing your audience? Are clients actually ready to sign on the dotted line because they listen to your podcast? That's exactly what we figure out in a podcast strategy session. In 1 hour, we build a clear return on investment driven plan to make sure every interview or episode moves your business forward. Want to see if this is the right move for you? Schedule a coffee chat using a link in the description. All right, back to the episode.
Now, let's get into our faith note. For those that don't know, we end every single episode with a faith note because this podcast and the business behind it, iMoves Management, is based in the scripture Matthew 17:20. If you have the faith of even just a mustard seed, You could tell that mountain to go from here to there and it will move. And so because it takes a whole lot of faith to be a business owner, because it takes a whole lot of faith to show up every single day and not know if this thing is going to work, that's where I'm always coming from. So today's faith note is coming from Proverbs 27, chapter 27, verse 23 through 27. Back in Proverbs, like I mentioned last time, I have been skipping around in the books of wisdom. So let me read this to you, and then I'm going to provide some context. So Proverbs 27, verse 23 through 27. Be sure you know the condition of your flocks. Give careful attention to your herds, for riches do not endure forever, and a crown is not secure for all generations. When the hay is removed and new growth appears, and the grass from the hills is gathered in, the lambs will provide you with clothing, and the goats with the price of a field. You will have plenty of goats' milk to feed your family and to nourish your female servants. So for me, this came down to leadership and stewarding leadership. Being able to, again, when we think about the context of what Lecrae is doing and seeing that pivot in real time, being able to steward that leadership from your employees to your contractors to your clients, you are creating space for people to feel comfortable. You are creating space for people to feel like their answer is being solved. You're creating space for people to create community within you, within the space that you are crafting, within the audience that you are crafting, within the brand and the business that you are crafting. And it's our responsibility to nurture it. So in every time I come to this mic, every time that I come to film something for Coffee Chats podcast, I take on the responsibility of being prepared. I take on the responsibility of being prepared for my guests when I have a guest episode, because that is stewarding the relationship. That's stewarding the leadership that you have. Because then not only is it fruitful for you, but it's fruitful for everybody around you. Which ultimately, a lot of us end up going into business because we see a problem that either we can do that, we can solve it better than, or at least we think we can solve it better than somebody else, or we can't find the answer anywhere else. So being able to lean into thoughtful stewardship of our leadership is incredibly important. Lecrae is a really good example of that because, again, we have the opportunity to navigate conversations within our brand, within our content, and we have the responsibility to nurture the conversations that we're bringing to the forefront. All right. I think that is it. Thank you for being here. I will talk to y'all later. Bye.
You've been listening to Coffee Chats podcast from iMoves Management, a marketing agency serving small business owners. This episode was written, hosted, produced, and edited by me, Tahjma VanBuren. If you want to learn more about anything you heard on the show, schedule your coffee chat using the link in the description. We'll talk all things podcasting and how to use it as a true marketing strategy for you and your small business. Go to imovesmanagement.com for further information. Thank you to our listeners for supporting the show. Bye.